The Haunting of Hollowfield Asylum. Welcome, dear listeners. A house in the snow, when the roads are closed and the only sound left is the fire and your own thoughts. Tonight we are going somewhere that quiet has lasted 20 years. An old asylum wing at the edge of a Northumberland estate, where the staff still lower their voices past a certain door. Before we begin, tell me where you are listening from tonight. Are you under a blanket with the lamps low? On a late shift with the house asleep around you? Just sitting with a cup of tea, letting the evening go quiet? I read every comment, so let me know. Now, the snow is beginning to fall over Hollowfield. Let us step in. Chapter 1. The Letter from Hollowfield. It was in the January of 1897, during a week when London lay under a foot of snow and the cabs had given up the streets to men on foot, that a letter reached Baker Street, which I have since had cause to remember as the strangest a client of Holmes's ever wrote to him. I had come round that morning to find Holmes still in his dressing gown at 11 o'clock, a circumstance rare enough in itself, and the letter open on his knee. He did not look up when I entered. "Watson," he said, "what do you make of a woman who nursed for 30 years, retired to a cottage on a moor, and writes to a stranger in London to confess that she watched a man die 20 years ago and said nothing?" I sat down opposite him and asked to see the letter. The hand was firm for a woman of her years, the ink pale with age at the fold, as though the paper had been kept in a drawer a long while before it was used. "She has not confessed to anything in the letter," I said, reading it through. "She says only that she attended a death in 1877, at a place called Hollowfield, and that the manner of it has troubled her since." "Read further." I read on, and here the hand grew less steady. The writer, a Mrs. Rennick, said that she had that week received news of a second death at the same house, that of the resident physician, a Dr. Venn, and that the circumstances of his death were being called an accident by everyone but herself. She did not say why she doubted it. She asked only that Mr. Holmes come north, at whatever fee he cared to name, before the funeral, which the family wished held quickly on account of the weather. "A retired nurse," I said, "writing about a death she witnessed as a young woman, and now a fresh death at the same house. It has the shape of a case, Holmes, though a cold one." "It has the shape of several cases," said Holmes, "folded one inside another, which is precisely why I mean to go. Ring for Mrs. Hudson. We shall want the timetable for the Northern Line, and you had better bring your service revolver, though I doubt we shall need it for anything so honest as a burglar." He passed me a second sheet, which I had not seen, evidently enclosed with the letter. It was a short account, in a different and less careful hand, headed "For Mr. Holmes, from the constable at Coldbeck, at Mrs. Rennick's request." I read it twice before I understood what it described. The body of Dr. Alaric Venn had been found on the morning of the 9th, in the walled yard behind the asylum wing at Hollowfield, known locally as the Old Tower Ground. The snow had fallen steadily through the night before and had stopped an hour before dawn, so that the yard lay under an unbroken white when the gardener crossed it at 6:30. Dr. Venn lay near the far wall, beneath the window of his own study, a bottle of laudanum near his hand, and no mark of violence upon him that the local surgeon could find. But the footprints troubled the constable, as they now troubled me. A single line of prints led away from the body, across the yard, to the gate in the wall, and through it. There were no prints leading to the body at all. The snow around him, in every direction save the one line leading away, lay smooth and undisturbed, as though he had fallen from the sky itself, or been set down by hands that left no mark of their own passage. "It is not possible," I said. "It is only unexplained," said Holmes, rising and reaching for his pipe. "There is a great difference, Watson, though the country constabulary rarely trouble to learn it. A man does not fall from a clear night sky into a locked yard with a bottle of laudanum in his hand. Someone put him there, and someone left, And the question that interests me is not how the second thing was done, which is a matter of ordinary cunning, but why the first was done in a manner designed to look as though it could not have been done at all. I asked him what he made of Mrs. Rennick, who had summoned him. "I make of her," said Holmes slowly, "a woman who has carried something for 20 years and has now decided, on the occasion of a second death, that she can carry it no longer. Whether she means to hand it to me whole, or only in such pieces as suit her, I cannot say until I have looked at her face. Pack for a fortnight, Watson, and dress warm. Northumberland in January does not forgive a light coat, and I suspect Hollowfield will forgive still less." I asked him, as he searched among his papers for a railway guide, why a country doctor's death, however oddly arranged, should draw him from London at all, when a dozen cases of greater apparent moment lay unopened on his desk. "Because the apparent moment of a case, Watson, is generally in inverse proportion to its true interest," he said. "A man shot in a Mayfair drawing-room before 6 witnesses is rarely a puzzle at all, whatever the newspapers make of it. A country doctor found dead in a locked yard, with footprints that contradict themselves, and a nurse who writes across 3 counties to summon a stranger rather than speak to her own family solicitor, is a puzzle built with some care, by someone who has had 20 years in which to consider how such things ought to be arranged. I do not turn away from that kind of architecture merely because it wears a tweed coat instead of a dinner jacket." He found his railway guide at last, ran his finger down the column of northern departures, and named the 2 o'clock from King's Cross as the last train that would see us into Coldbeck before the branch line closed for the night against the weather. I went to pack, and left him still at his papers, the letter from Hollowfield propped against the mantel clock where he could see it as he worked, as though he meant to keep it under his eye until he had earned the right to set it aside. We caught the 2 o'clock train from King's Cross, the snow already thickening again over the platform, and it was not until we were well past Peterborough, the fields white on either side and the light failing early, that Holmes spoke again, half to himself, looking out at the darkening country. 20 years is a long time to keep a silence, Watson. I wonder what has finally broken it. Chapter 2. Snow on the Northumberland Road. The train that should have reached Newcastle by 9 did not reach it until well past midnight, the line blocked twice by drifts north of York, so that we came at last into Coldbeck Station in the small hours, the platform lamp the only light for a mile in any direction. A man was waiting for us there with a trap and a shaggy pony, wrapped to the eyes in a plaid muffler, who named himself as Tam Elliot, coachman to the house, and said little else until we were well clear of the village. "Mrs. Rennick's letter said you'd come," he offered at last, when the silence had grown too long even for a Northumberland man. "She'll be glad of it. There's been queer talk in the village since the doctor died, and queerer talk before that, if you'll pardon me saying so to strangers." Holmes, who had said nothing since Newcastle, roused himself at this. "What manner of talk, Mr. Elliot?" "Of the old trouble at the Tower, 20 year back and more. My father was head groom then, and he'd not speak of it above a whisper even to my mother, God rest her. There was a lady died up at Hollowfield, the squire's own sister, and there was talk after of voices heard in the east wing where no living soul had business to be. The wings had a bad name in the village since, doctor or no doctor, and Dr. Venn's death has only set the tongues going again." I asked him whether he believed in such things himself. "I believe a man can die of an accident on a cold night same as any other night," said Tam, with the flat good sense of his kind. "And I believe folk will make a ghost story of anything they cannot otherwise account for. But I'll not walk past that gate after dark if I can help it, and there's not a man in the stables will either, and that is the truth of the matter, sir. Believe what you like of ghosts." Holmes asked no more of him, and we went on in silence, through a country I had never seen before, and have seen only once since. The road climbed steadily from the village, between dry stone walls half buried in drift, until the trees fell away altogether and we came out onto open moor, the snow unbroken to the horizon, under a moon that showed itself only in ragged gaps between the clouds. I have travelled with Holmes into a great many strange corners of England, but I remember still the first sight of Ravenscar Tower, black against that white waste, a square Norman keep, with later building grown up around its base like ivy round an old oak, one wing dark and shuttered, and set apart from the rest by a high wall of its own. "That will be Hollowfield," said Holmes quietly, and I felt him lean forward beside me to look at it as we passed. We were not taken to the tower itself that night, but to the village inn, the Sedgwick Arms, where a fire had been kept for us and a supper of cold beef and ale. Mrs. Rennick having thought it better, Tam explained, that we should come to the house fresh in the morning rather than disturb a household already much disturbed. Holmes ate little and said less, and I saw him more than once go to the window and stand looking out at the black shape of the tower against the snow, as a man might look at a chessboard set with a problem he had not yet begun to solve. "You are unusually quiet, Holmes," I said, when the landlord had left us to our fire. "I am listening," he said. "A London case announces itself in newspapers and telegrams and the talk of clubs. A country case announces itself in the things a coachman lets slip when he has decided you are safe to talk to. I have learned more from Mr. Elliot in 20 minutes than from 3 pages of the constable's report. You think the old story bears on the new one. I think it would be remarkable if it did not. A house does not earn a reputation for haunting by accident, Watson, and a nurse does not write to a stranger in London 20 years after a death unless something has shaken loose a memory she had thought settled. Our Mrs. Rennick has waited a long time to speak. I should like to know what finally moved her tongue, and I do not think it was Dr. Venn's death alone." I remarked that Tam Elliot had spoken of voices in the East Wing, and asked whether Holmes gave any weight at all to such talk, coming as it did from a sensible enough man in every other particular. "I give no weight whatever to voices, Watson, but I give a good deal of weight to the fact that sensible men repeat them. A ghost story does not take root in a stable yard by chance. It takes root because something in the true history of a place will not otherwise be spoken of by daylight, and finds its way out instead by night, dressed in a shape the tellers find easier to bear than the plain fact beneath it. When I have the plain fact, I dare say the ghost will trouble Mr. Elliot's stable yard a good deal less, whatever else becomes of it." The pony laboured on through drifts that in places stood higher than the wheel hubs, and twice Tam Elliot climbed down to lead the animal by its head, through ground he judged too treacherous to trust from the driving seat, so that our progress up onto the moor was slower even than the state of the roads alone might have accounted for. I asked him, during one such pause, how far the tower stood from the nearest neighbour, and he answered that Ravenscar had no near neighbour to speak of, the land for 2 miles round belonging entirely to the Sedgwick estate, and the nearest other house of any size being the rectory, hard by the church at the village's edge, where the Reverend Marsh had lived alone since his wife's death some years before. I asked him what else it might have been. "That," said Holmes, knocking out his pipe against the fender, "is precisely what I intend to ask her, and I shall watch her face while she answers, which will tell me a good deal more than her words. Get some sleep, Watson. Whatever waits for us at that gate in the morning, it has waited 20 years already, and will keep a few hours longer." I did not sleep well, for the wind had risen, and I lay listening to it work at the old inn's shutters, and thinking, not for the first time in our long partnership, that Holmes's restlessness in a quiet place was itself a kind of warning, as reliable in its way as a hound's low growl before it will properly bark. Chapter 3. The wing behind the locked gate, Ravenscar Tower, received us the next morning under a sky the colour of pewter, the snow still lying deep and untouched across the park, broken only by the single-carriage drive that curved up from the lodge gate to the main door. The squire himself met us on the steps, a heavy fair man of perhaps 45, named Edmund Sedgwick, whose handshake was firm enough, but whose eyes had the reddened, sleepless look of a man managing a crisis he did not fully understand. "Mr. Holmes, Doctor, I confess I hardly know whether to thank Mrs. Rennick for sending for you or to wish she had left matters to the coroner," he said, leading us in past a hall hung with the antlers and portraits of Sedgwicks 4 centuries deep. There has been talk enough in this county without a detective from London to feed it further. I shall try not to feed it, Squire Sedgwick, said Holmes mildly, though I make no promise as to what I may be obliged to uncover in the feedings place. I understand the household includes a resident physician's practice, a village doctor besides, and a good deal of history I have not yet been told. Perhaps you would begin with the arrangement of the house. Sedgwick explained it as we walked. Hollowfield, the East Wing, had been built by his grandfather as a private asylum for the care of one afflicted daughter of the family, and had since taken a small number of paying patients from good families elsewhere in the county, never more than 6 or 7 at a time, under the charge of a resident physician who lived on the premises. Dr. Alaric Venn had held the post for the past 11 years, following his father, Dr. Cornelius Venn, who had held it more than 30 years before him and had died in the post. The wing was reached by its own gate in the garden wall and kept, by long custom, quite separate from the family's own rooms in the tower proper. And the village has its own doctor besides, said Holmes. A Dr. Hollis, I am told. Something crossed the squire's face, gone as quickly as it came. Dr. Hollis attends the village and the tenant farms. He and Venn had some professional disagreement over a bill some months back, nothing more, though I dare say the constable has made more of it than it deserves, given the temper of the times. We were taken through to the east wing by a narrow covered passage. Emerging into a walled yard, I recognized at once from the constable's account a square of ground, perhaps 40 feet across, bounded on 3 sides by the blank wall of the asylum building and on the 4th by the garden wall with its single locked gate. Above us, on the first floor, a tall window looked directly down into the yard. Dr. Venn's study, said Sedgwick quietly. A woman was waiting for us at the door of the wing itself, tall and spare, perhaps 65, in the plain dark dress of her calling, her hands folded before her, with the particular stillness of a person long practiced in keeping her face from her feelings. Sedgwick presented her as Mrs. Rennick, who had once nursed at Hollowfield under old Dr. Venn and had retired these 10 years past to a cottage on the moor, though she still came to the house when illness or death required an extra pair of experienced hands. Mr. Holmes, she said, and her voice, though quiet, did not shake. I am glad you have come. I did not think you would, and I am glad of it. You wrote a remarkable letter, Mrs. Rennick, said Holmes, watching her with the close, unhurried attention I had seen him turn on 100 witnesses before her. I should like to hear the whole of what troubles you in your own time, but first I must see the ground where Dr. Venn was found, before more snow falls or more feet disturb it. She led us into the yard herself, and stood at its edge while Holmes went down on one knee in the snow, indifferent to the cold, and began his examination in the silence that I had long since learned not to break. We were joined there, within a few minutes, by a thin, anxious man introduced as Dr. Hollis, who had been sent for, he said, to confirm the local surgeon's finding of accidental death for the coroner's convenience, and who watched Holmes's work with an expression I could not at first read, though I set it down, wrongly as it proved, to no more than professional curiosity. Hollis was a slight man of perhaps 40, ill at ease in his own coat, who spoke of Dr. Venn with the careful, measured praise of a man anxious not to be thought to speak ill of the dead, and who volunteered, unasked, that the two of them had exchanged some warm words the previous month over an unpaid account, a matter he was plainly eager to set before us himself, rather than have us hear it first from another mouth. It was nothing, Mr. Holmes, a professional disagreement such as passes between medical men the country over. I would not have you think it weighed on my mind beyond the ordinary vexation of an unpaid bill. I think nothing yet, Dr. Hollis, of anyone in this house, said Holmes, not troubling to look up from his work. I find it saves a great deal of time, in the early stages of an inquiry, to think nothing whatever, and to listen instead to what each person volunteers before I have thought to ask for it. Hollis coloured slightly at this, and said no more, and Sedgwick, plainly uncomfortable at the exchange, suggested we come in out of the cold and take some refreshment before continuing, an offer Holmes declined for himself, though he pressed me to accept it and learn what I could of the household's temper while he finished in the yard alone. I went in gladly enough, for the cold had begun to work through even my heaviest coat, and spent a useful half-hour with Mrs. Fiske over tea, learning the shape of the household, the names of the 6 patients then resident in the wing, and the particular fact, offered without any apparent significance by the matron herself, that Mrs. Rennick had been the only person outside the family permitted a key to the wing's garden gate in all the years of her service, a privilege never extended to any other nurse before or since. Chapter 4. What the footprints would not say. The single line of prints ran, as the constable's account had described, from a point close under the study window to the gate in the garden wall, a distance of perhaps 30 feet, and nowhere in the whole white expanse of the yard, save along that one line and around the huddled shape where the body had lain, was the snow disturbed at all. Holmes worked along the trail on his hands and knees for the better part of 20 minutes, measuring the stride with a length of cord he carried for the purpose, examining the depth and angle of each print with his lens, and saying nothing whatever, while Sedgwick shifted his feet at the yard's edge, and Dr. Hollis watched, with his hands thrust deep in his coat pockets. The prints are a single man's, in a heavy boot, walking at an ordinary pace, neither hurried nor unsteady, Holmes said at last, rising and dusting the snow from his knees. They begin abruptly, a few feet from where the body lay, and they end at the gate. There is no trace whatever of any foot approaching the place where Dr. Venn was found, from the gate, from the wing door, or from anywhere else. Then he fell from the window, said Sedgwick, and rose again and walked to the gate before he collapsed a second time. It is the only explanation that fits what the ground shows. It is an explanation that fits nothing at all, Squire Sedgwick, since your own surgeon found no injury from a fall, and death by laudanum does not permit a man to rise and walk 30 feet afterward as though nothing troubled him. Holmes looked up at the study window above us. What time did the snow cease falling on the night in question? It was Dr. Hollis who answered. A little too quickly, I thought, though I made nothing of it at the time. The constable noted it in his report. The fall had ceased by 5:30, and the body was found at 6:30, so that the snow had lain undisturbed for a full hour before the gardener crossed the yard. And when was Dr. Venn last seen alive? By his own attendant, at 11 the night before, when he retired to his study to work, as was his custom. Holmes was silent for a long moment, looking from the window to the line of prints and back again, and I saw in his face the particular stillness that meant he had found the shape of a thing, though not yet all its edges. When he spoke again, it was not to answer the question in the air, but to ask another. Mrs. Rennick, were you in this house on the night Dr. Venn died? She had come to stand at the yard's edge again, and she answered without hesitation, though her hands had tightened on themselves. I was, Mr. Holmes. The weather had closed the road to the village, and I had come to sit with a patient in low spirits, and stayed the night in the small room off the nurse's hall, as I have done many times before. Did you leave that room in the night? I did not, she said, and then, after a pause I noted, and did not then understand, not until the household was roused at 7. Holmes asked nothing further of her in the yard, though I saw him note something in the small book he carried, and when Sedgwick and Dr. Hollis had gone ahead of us into the wing, out of the cold, he drew me aside by the gate itself and stood looking back across the yard at the window above. What do you make of it, Holmes? I asked him. A man cannot walk from a point of empty snow to a gate. He must have started somewhere. He did start somewhere, Watson, and I believe I know where, though I shall not say so yet, even to you, for I have been wrong before on less evidence than this, and I do not care to plant an idea in your honest face where the whole household may read it before I am ready. I will say only that the trail troubles me less than the timing, and the timing troubles me less than Mrs. Rennick's pause before she finished her answer. A witness who tells the truth does not need to correct herself in the middle of a single sentence. He would say no more, and we went in to breakfast in a silence I had learned over many years, not to press. Over the meal, laid for us alone in a small breakfast room while the rest of the household kept to its own quarters, I found myself turning the timing over in my own mind, the way a man will worry a splinter he cannot quite see. If the snow had stopped at 5:30, and the body had not been found until 6:30, then a full hour had passed in which the yard lay as it would remain for the constable's inspection, and I said as much to Holmes, adding that an hour seemed a narrow window in which to arrange so careful a deception, if deception it was. "An hour is not the window that concerns me," said Holmes, buttering his toast with the same close attention he gave to a chemical retort. "It is the 6 hours before it that concern me, the hours in which the snow was still falling and the yard, whatever happened in it, was being steadily and silently erased. A man planning to leave a false trail does not choose to leave it in falling snow, Watson, for falling snow is his enemy, filling every mark as fast as it is made. He chooses, if he has any sense at all, to leave his trail in the last dry minutes before the sky clears, when a single line of prints will stand out clean and undisputed against everything the night has already smoothed away. I do not yet say that is what happened here. I say only that it is the shape a clever plan would take, and I have not yet found a reason to think we are dealing with anything less than a clever plan." I asked him whether Mrs. Rennick's household knew we had been sent for by her particular hand rather than by the family, and he said he thought not, for Sedgwick himself had seemed almost surprised, on the steps that morning, to learn from our own mouths who had written the letter that brought us. It was a small thing, and I did not think much of it at the time, though I noted, as I have learned to note most things Holmes considers worth remarking upon, that he asked Mrs. Fiske the same question again before the day was out, and again received the same answer. Chapter 5. The Ledger of 20 Years. We spent the better part of that afternoon among the household, Holmes moving from room to room with the quiet, unhurried patience he kept for cases where he judged the truth lay buried rather than hidden, a distinction he was fond of drawing, and one I had come, over the years, to understand. He spoke first with the attendant, who had last seen Venn alive, a solid, unimaginative man named Petch, who could tell us only that the doctor had seemed his ordinary self, perhaps a little preoccupied, and had asked not to be disturbed. He spoke next with the matron of the wing, a stout, capable woman named Mrs. Fiske, who had charge of the patients and who let slip, in the course of an otherwise unremarkable account of the household's routine, that Dr. Venn had spent a good part of the past month closeted in the old records room, going through papers that had belonged to his father. "What manner of papers?" Holmes asked her. "I could not say, sir. Old ledgers, mostly, from his father's time. He had them brought up from the cellar himself, and would not let even Petch help him carry them, which I thought strange, for they were heavy enough." Holmes asked to see the records room, and Mrs. Fiske led us down a stone stair to a low chamber at the wing's foot, where a row of iron-bound chests stood along one wall, and a table near the single high window bore the marks, in a fine grey dust, of something recently moved. Holmes went over the table with his lens, and then the chests themselves, several of which stood unlocked, their contents disturbed. "He was looking for something in particular," Holmes said, "and I think, from the dust here, and the dust left undisturbed there, that he found it, and that he took what he found away with him, for I see no ledger here that was not returned to its place before the room was locked again." "Mrs. Fiske, how far back do these records run?" "To my grandfather's time in service here, sir, and further, I believe, though I have never had cause to look." Holmes went through the unlocked chests himself before we left the room, working with the quick, methodical patience I had watched him bring to 100 such tasks, lifting each ledger only enough to read its spine before setting it back precisely as he had found it. Most were nothing more than the ordinary accounts of the wing, physic, and linen and coal, entries in a careful clerkly hand running back further than either of us cared to count. It was the gap that interested him more than anything the chest still held, a single missing year, among a run otherwise unbroken, the ledger for 1877 absent from its place between 1876 and 1878, as cleanly as a drawn tooth leaves a gap in an otherwise even row. He did not take the whole run, only the 1 year that mattered, Holmes said, straightening at last. A man in a hurry takes everything within reach. A man who knows precisely what he is looking for takes only the single volume that answers his purpose, and troubles himself to leave the rest exactly as he found it, so that a careless eye would never know anything was missing at all. Dr. Venn was neither hasty nor careless, Watson, whatever else may be said of him. It was Watson's chance remark, made idly as we climbed back up the stair, that turned the afternoon's search in the direction it needed. I had asked Mrs. Fiske, out of no more than ordinary curiosity, whether the wing had always held so few patients, and she had answered that it had once held rather more, before the trouble of 1877, after which the family had grown careful about whom they admitted. What trouble was that? I asked. She glanced at Holmes before she answered, as though seeking permission and receiving none, told it in a lowered voice, the way I imagine such stories are told in that house whenever a stranger asks. The old squire, Sedgwick's father, had lost his wife some years before, and had fallen, in his grief, under the influence of a travelling spiritualist who claimed to bring him messages from her beyond the grave, a man calling himself Silas Tarrant, who had lodged at the Tower for the better part of 2 years, and had, by the end of them, drawn a very great deal of money from the estate. The squire's own sister, Miss Honoria Sedgwick, had suspected the fraud from the first, and had said so openly, at dinner and before guests, until her brother, persuaded by Tarrant that grief had turned her mind, had her placed under Dr. Cornelius Venn's care in the wing she had once visited, only as a family charity. She had died there within the year, of what the certificate called a wasting sickness, and Tarrant had left the county within the month, and the old squire had never spoken his sister's name again in Mrs. Fiske's hearing. And Mrs. Rennick, said Holmes quietly, was she nursing here then? She was newly come to the post, sir, little more than a girl. She sat with Miss Honoria in her last days, I have heard it said, more than any other soul in the house. Holmes said nothing more to Mrs. Fiske, but that evening, when the household had settled and the wing lay quiet, he asked me to walk with him along the moor road toward Mrs. Rennick's cottage, a mile or so from the Tower gate, where a single lit window showed against the dark. You mean to see her tonight? I mean to see whether she will see me, said Holmes, and I confess I do not yet know what I shall ask her, only that a woman who sat by a dying girl for nights together 20 years ago, and who nursed the son of the very physician who signed that girl's death into a wasting sickness, is a woman who has carried 2 griefs where I had supposed only one, and I begin to think, Watson, that the second death in that yard was committed not to hide a stranger's secret, but to protect the last living witness to the first. I asked him whether he thought Mrs. Fiske's account of the old scandal reliable, seeing that she herself had been a girl of no more than 10 or 11 years old when it happened, and could know it only at second hand, as the household's collective memory rather than her own. A household's collective memory is often more reliable than any single witness's, Watson, precisely because it has been tested and corrected by 20 years of retelling among people who had every opportunity to catch one another in error, and every inclination to do so, servants being no more charitable to one another's inaccuracies than the rest of us. What she cannot tell me is what Mrs. Rennick herself felt, standing at that bedside, night after night, watching a young woman she must have come to know well, fade under a diagnosis I begin to suspect was never fairly made. That is the account I mean to have tonight, if she will give it to me, and I do not think, from the tone of her letter, that she means to refuse me for very much longer. The lamp in Mrs. Rennick's cottage window, when we came at last within sight of it across the darkening moor, burned low and steady, and I remember thinking, as we turned back toward the Tower, without disturbing her that first evening, for Holmes judged the hour too late and the ground too treacherous to press on further, that there was something in the sight of that single small light, alone against so much dark and empty country, which seemed to hold the whole weight of the story we had come north to uncover. Chapter 6. The Rumour in the Village. We did not reach the cottage that night after all, for we had gone no more than a quarter-mile along the moor road when a light showed ahead of us, swinging low and quick, and Tam Elliot came up out of the dark on the pony, breathless, to say that Constable Byers had that hour arrested Dr. Hollis in the village, on a warrant sworn before the magistrate, for the wilful murder of Dr. Alaric Venn. "On what evidence?" Holmes demanded, turning back with me toward the village at once. "The billing quarrel, sir, and worse besides, so they're saying. A boot found at Hollis's surgery, matching the print in the yard, and a debt of near £200, owing to Venn's estate, that Hollis stood to lose by if the doctor lived to press it. The constable's had it in his head since yesterday morning, I reckon, and Squire Sedgwick pressing him besides, for the funeral's held back on the coroner's account, and the family wants it done and settled before Sunday. We found the village public house given over entirely to the arrest, half of Coldbeck crowded at the windows, and the constable, a stolid, well-meaning man plainly out of his depth, standing rather too proudly beside his prisoner in the tap-room, for want, I supposed, of a proper cell. Dr. Hollis himself sat white and shaking, protesting in a thin voice that he had never in his life owned a pair of boots of the size described, and that any man in the county might have bought the same from the same bootmaker in Newcastle who supplied half the gentlemen for 30 miles round. Holmes examined the boot in question for perhaps 30 seconds, turned it over once in his hands, and set it down again with an expression I knew well. The particular contempt he reserved for evidence, assembled to fit a conclusion rather than the reverse. Constable Byers, this boot has never stood in snow in its life. The sole shows no wear consistent with the walk from the village to the tower and back, which any man who committed this crime must have made twice over in a single night, and the leather is a full size larger than the print I measured myself this morning in the yard. You have arrested a frightened man on the strength of a grudge and a bootmaker's coincidence, and I would counsel you strongly to release him before the assize makes a fool of you both." The constable, to his credit, was more troubled by this than offended, and after some further argument, and a promise from Holmes to lay his own findings before the coroner in good time, Dr. Hollis was permitted to go home under a loose sort of watch rather than to the county jail, which was as much, Holmes told me privately, as we could hope to win that night. It was on our way back through the village, past the church, that we came upon the second small mystery of that evening, though I did not think it a mystery at the time. The Reverend Aldous Marsh, vicar of the parish, passed us on the road from the direction of the tower, walking quickly with his head down against the wind, and started visibly at Holmes's greeting before composing himself. "A late errand, Mr. Marsh," Holmes observed, mild as ever. "A parishioner in low health, Mr. Holmes, nothing more. I do not care to say whose, for the sake of the family's feeling, but I think you will find it has nothing whatever to do with your inquiry." He said no more, and went on his way with the air of a man glad to be gone, and I confess I thought little of it, though Holmes, I later learned, thought a good deal more, and had the truth of the matter, discreetly and without troubling the vicar's parishioner, before another day had passed. "The village will always give you a murderer if you ask it plainly enough, Watson," Holmes said, as we walked back at last toward the inn through the settling snow. "A man in debt, a man out late, a boot of the wrong size. It is Mrs. Rennick I mean to see tomorrow, and no one else, for I begin to believe she is the only soul in this county who has told me the truth and left out the half of it that matters." I said that I had thought the vicar's manner strange, for all that his explanation seemed reasonable enough on its face, and Holmes agreed that it had been strange, though not, he thought, in any way that touched our inquiry directly. "A parson out late on an errand of conscience will always look a little hunted, Watson, whether he has done wrong or only heard of wrong done by another and sworn to keep it close. I do not think Mr. Marsh killed Dr. Venn. I think Mr. Marsh knows something he has promised not to tell, which is a different matter altogether, and one I may have occasion to press him on before we are done. though gently, for a man's sworn confidence is not a thing to be broken lightly, even in the service of the law. We had reached the inn by then, and found Squire Sedgwick himself waiting for us in the tap-room, plainly agitated by the news of Hollis's release, and anxious to know whether Holmes now considered the household itself under suspicion, a question Holmes answered with a courtesy that did not, I noticed, actually answer it at all. Sedgwick pressed further, asking whether the inquiry might not be concluded more quietly and more quickly if Holmes would only accept the coroner's likely finding of misadventure and spare the family the further indignity of a London detective's continued presence in the county. An appeal Holmes met with a look I had seen him turn on a great many anxious clients before, patient, immovable, and entirely unmoved by any argument founded on convenience rather than truth. "I am engaged by Mrs. Rennick, Squire Sedgwick, and I do not conclude an inquiry before I have concluded it, however much comfort an early finish might afford the family. I hope to trouble your household very little longer, but I will not shorten the work to suit anyone's calendar, be it the coroner's or your own." Chapter 7. Holmes closes the study door. Holmes did not go to Mrs. Rennick's cottage the next morning, as he had said he would. Instead, he shut himself into Dr. Venn's study, the room above the walled yard, for the better part of 3 hours, and would allow no one, myself included, to enter until he had finished. I spent the time with Squire Sedgwick in the library, answering as best I could his anxious questions about how long the matter might yet take, and it was near noon when Holmes at last opened the study door and called me in. The room was much as its late occupant had left it, a heavy desk beneath the window, shelves of medical volumes and parish histories, a small locked cabinet in one corner that Holmes had evidently persuaded open, for it stood ajar, empty save for a thin film of dust, where something had lately rested and been removed. "The ledger is gone," I said. "The ledger is gone, and it did not walk out of this room by itself," said Holmes, seating himself at the desk and regarding me across it with the particular brightness he wore when a case had come, in his own mind, to its turning point, though he would not yet show me the whole of it. "Watson, I want you to consider the window." I went to it and looked down into the yard, now trampled by 2 days of investigation, the original prints long since lost among the new. "It looks down directly onto the spot where the body was found." "It does. And it does not open, Watson, not by the ordinary means. Try the catch." I tried it, and found it fixed fast, painted over with the thick, unbroken paint of years of neglect, plainly not opened in a long while by any ordinary hand. "Then how—" "The lower sash is fixed, as you find, but observe the upper sash, above the reach of a man standing in the room, which shows a very different history." Holmes drew a chair beneath the window and stood upon it, and I saw now what his lens had already told him, a thin, bright line in the paint along the upper frame where it had lately been forced. This sash was opened, Watson, and not by Dr. Venn reaching up to air a stuffy room at midnight in January. It was opened from within by someone who required it open for a purpose, and closed again afterward with some care, though not quite care enough. I understood him then, or thought I did, and felt something of the horror of it settle on me even before he said it aloud. He did not fall from this window living, Watson, nor did he walk from it dead. He was lowered from it by a length of cord or sheeting looped beneath the arms, some hours before the snow ceased to fall, so that the marks of his passage through the drift, and any mark the cord itself might have left, were smoothed away by the snow that continued to come down through the small hours. By the time the fall stopped, at 5:30, he had lain beneath this window the better part of 6 hours, and the ground around him had healed itself as cleanly as a wound beneath a bandage. And the single line of prints to the gate? Made afterward, Watson, in the last hour before dawn, after the snow had stopped and could no longer cover a fresh mark. Made, I believe, by someone who came out through this wing's own door, crossed the yard once, and left by the gate, quite unaware, or perhaps quite deliberately aware, that the one clean line of prints in an otherwise undisturbed yard would appear to every eye that saw it as the track of a man walking away alive, when it was in truth the track of the only other living soul who had reason to be there that night. I asked him whether he now knew who had made that final walk. "I know who had the strength to lower a grown man's weight from a window by a length of cord without waking a household," said Holmes slowly, "which is not, on the face of it, a task suited to a woman of 65 years. But I know also, Watson, that a nurse of 30 years' service has hands stronger than most men give them credit for, and a mind trained by long practice to move a helpless body without noise, for that is the whole of her trade. I do not yet have proof I would care to lay before a magistrate. I have only the shape of the thing, and a very old grief that I believe still walks in that yard, whenever the snow lies deep enough to hide it." I asked him what remained to be done before that shape could become proof enough to satisfy a court, and he counted the points off on his fingers as we sat over the last of the coffee, in the manner I had seen him use 100 times to order his own thoughts as much as to instruct mine. "I must know what the missing ledger contained, and I believe only Mrs. Rennick can tell me that with certainty, since I do not think Dr. Venn confided its contents to any other living soul before he died. I must know why, if she has carried this secret 20 years in silence, she chose this particular week to write to a detective in London rather than simply waiting, as she had waited so long already, for the danger to pass. And I must know," he said, folding the last finger down, "whether the woman who wrote so carefully worded a letter, asking me to come before the funeral rather than after, did so because she genuinely wished the truth uncovered, or because she wished to be certain, above all else, that whatever truth I uncovered would be one she had already had a hand in shaping." "You think she means to guide you?" "I think a woman clever enough to falsify a death certificate at 20 and keep the secret whole for 2 decades is a woman clever enough to know that the surest way to control an investigation is to appear to have summoned it herself. I do not say this to condemn her before I have heard her, Watson, only to remind myself and you that grief and cunning are not strangers to one another, and often keep house together far more comfortably than either likes to admit." Chapter 8. The Dead Man Walks. Holmes's plan, when at last he laid it before me that afternoon, was of a kind I had seen him use before, though never, I think, in circumstances so heavy with an old and private sorrow, and I confess I liked it little, though I could propose nothing better. "Mrs. Rennick has lived 20 years believing her worst secret safe with the dead," he said, as we walked the moor road toward her cottage in the last grey light of the afternoon. "She believed it safe a second time, until Dr. Venn began turning over his father's papers, and she found she must act, or be exposed by a son seeking only to clear his father's name at the cost of hers. I do not think she is a woman easily frightened by threats, Watson, for she has carried a heavier one than I could make her, alone, for 2 decades. But I think she is a woman who has never stopped believing, in some quiet chamber of her own mind, that Miss Honoria Sedgwick's death was not properly answered for, and that belief I mean to use, though I take no pleasure in it." He would not tell me the whole of what he intended, only that I was to wait in the lane below the cottage, out of sight, and come at once if I heard him call. It was full dark by the time we reached the place, a single low stone cottage with its window lit, smoke rising straight in the still, frozen air. Holmes left me at the gate and went forward alone, and what followed I had afterward from his own account, given to me that same night by the fire at the inn, and I set it down here as nearly as I can in his words. He had gone first to the window, not the door, and stood a moment in the dark garden looking in, where Mrs. Rennick sat before her own small fire with a Bible unopened on her knee, her face turned toward the flames in the particular stillness of a woman keeping vigil with her own thoughts. He had then done a thing he told me he had debated with himself the whole walk from the tower and had decided upon only at the gate itself. He had taken from his coat a soft dark hat of the kind Dr. Venn had been known to wear, borrowed without asking from a peg in the study, and holding it so that his shadow fell across the curtain in the shape of a man standing at the glass. He had knocked, once, softly, upon the frame, and said nothing at all. He heard, he told me, the Bible fall to the floor within. By the time he had come round to the door and let himself in, for she had not risen to open it, he found her sunk into her chair, her hands pressed to her mouth, staring at the window where no shape now stood, and it was some minutes, he said, before she could master herself enough to see that it was Holmes himself before her, and not the thing her guilt had shown her in the glass. "You are a cruel man, Mr. Holmes," she said at last, when she could speak. "I am a tired one, Mrs. Rennick, and so, I think, are you, and I did not come here to frighten an old woman for the pleasure of it, but because I believe you have wanted, for 20 years and more, for someone to knock at that window and ask you the truth, and I do not think you would ever have opened the door to anyone who did not." She looked at him a long while, and then, he said, something in her face that had been held taut since he first saw her on the steps of Ravenscar Tower, simply let go, as a rope lets go when the strain upon it is finally eased, and she asked him, in a voice gone suddenly very old, whether he would sit down, for she believed she had a great deal to tell him, and did not think she had the strength to tell it standing. He had stayed her only a moment longer at the door, he told me, before calling for me at the gate, and had asked her one question first, before any other. A question he said he had turned over in his mind the whole walk from the tower, and had not been certain, even then, that he would have the resolve to put to her plainly. "Did you write to me, Mrs. Rennick, hoping I would find the truth, or hoping I would not?" She had not answered at once, he said, but had looked past him at the dark window, as though the shape he had shown her there a few minutes before still stood in the glass for her alone to see, and had said at last, very quietly, that she believed she had wanted both things equally, and had not known, until this very night, which of them had truly brought her pen to the paper. "That," Holmes told me, as we waited together for the fire in her small parlour to catch properly, the cold having followed us in from the garden, "is very often the truest answer any client gives me in the whole course of a case, Watson, and I have learned to trust it above almost anything spoken with greater confidence." Chapter 9. What the séance concealed, I was brought into the cottage some minutes after, at Holmes's call, and found Mrs. Rennick composed enough to speak, though her hands, folded again in her lap, had not stopped their small, ceaseless movement since I entered. She told the story slowly, and I set it down here as she gave it, for I think it deserves to be heard in something near her own words, though I have shortened it where I properly can. She had come to Hollowfield as a girl of 20, she said, in the last year of the old squire's grief for his wife, and had known Silas Tarrant only as a soft-spoken gentleman who came often to sit with the family and to hold what he called sittings in the tower's small drawing-room, from which the old squire always emerged calmer, and always, though she had not understood this at the time, poorer. Miss Honoria had seen through the man from the first, and had said so to anyone who would listen, and it was Dr. Cornelius Venn himself, old Venn, the present doctor's father, who had first suggested to the squire that his sister's agitation on the subject had passed beyond ordinary temper into something requiring care. "I did not believe it," Mrs. Rennick said. "I nursed her myself from the first week she was brought into the wing, and there was nothing wrong with her mind, Mr. Holmes. Nothing at all, save that she could see plainly what her brother would not, and said so too often and too loudly for the comfort of the men profiting by his blindness. Honoria's health had failed within the year, not from any illness Mrs. Rennick could name, but from confinement itself, from the slow, grinding weight of being disbelieved and shut away by everyone she loved, until one November night she had simply not woken, and old Dr. Venn had come, and looked at her only a moment, and told the young nurse what was to be written on the certificate, a wasting sickness of the lungs, and had told her further, not unkindly, but with the absolute certainty of a man who held her position entirely in his gift, that a scandal touching the family's spiritualist dealings, coming on top of a death in the asylum wing, would ruin the house, and very likely see the wing closed, and every nurse in it turned into the road without a character. "I signed what he told me to sign," she said. I was 20 years old, Mr. Holmes, and I had a mother and 2 young brothers depending on my wage, and I told myself, God forgive me, that the truth would serve Miss Honoria no better dead than a lie would, and that I had not killed her, whatever I had failed to save her from. I have told myself that every year since, and some years I have almost believed it. Tarrant had left the county within the month, his purpose served, and old Venn had lived out his years at Hollowfield, respected and undisturbed, and had died, when his time came, with the secret intact, and Mrs. Rennick had believed, until 3 weeks before Alaric Venn's death, that it would remain intact with him. I asked her, for it seemed to me the one part of her account still unclear, why old Venn had troubled to keep any record of the fraud at all, when silence alone would have served him better, and left nothing for a son to find 20 years later. He kept everything, Doctor. It was his nature, and I think, too, it was his protection, for a man who has helped conceal one wrong learns quickly that the surest defense against being made the sole villain of it is to have written proof that others stood beside him in the doing. He never meant Alaric to find that ledger. I am certain of that much. He meant it for his own safety while he lived, a thing to be shown only if the squire himself ever turned against him, and never dreamed his own son would go looking through it out of nothing more than grief and a wish to see his father remembered kindly. Holmes asked her whether she had ever, in 20 years, considered coming forward of her own accord, before any son's grief made the choice for her. Every year, Mr. Holmes. I considered it every single year, generally in November, when the anniversary came round, and every year I found some reason it would serve no one, that Honoria was past helping, that the squire had suffered enough already for his own blindness, that an old nurse's confession would only give the county something new to whisper about a family that had already been whispered over quite enough. I do not offer that as an excuse. I offer it only because I think you asked me a true question, and it deserves a true answer, however poor a one it makes me look. Then his son came to me, she said, with his father's old ledger in his hand, the one that recorded the sums Tarrant had drawn from the estate, sums old Venn had helped disguise as medical fees for a patient's care, and he told me he meant to make it right, Mr. Holmes, to clear his father's name by laying the whole truth before the squire, the fraud, the false certificate, all of it, for he had found, among his father's papers, a letter that named me as the one who had signed the death away. He did not mean cruelty by it. He believed, I think, that the truth after 20 years could only heal what it touched. He did not understand that for some of us, Mr. Holmes, the truth would not heal anything at all. It would only finish what shutting Honoria Sedgwick in that wing began. Chapter 10. The Confession by the Fire. She told the rest of it plainly, without the softening a lesser woman might have reached for, and I have thought since that this plainness, more than anything else in that long evening, was what convinced me she had indeed carried the weight of it alone for 20 years. For a person newly wicked seldom confesses with so little effort spent on her own excuse. She had gone to Venn's study on the night of his death, she said, meaning only to plead with him, to beg him to let the old grief lie where it had lain so long, and had found him unmoved, gentle but immovable, certain in his young man's conviction that his father's name and her own reputation both would be better served by daylight than by continued shadow. She had brought with her, from long habit of her calling, a preparation she still carried for her own occasional sleeplessness, and had, in a moment, she said she could not afterward fully account, for even to herself, put it into the glass of spirits he had poured for them both against the cold. I did not plan it when I set out that evening, Mr. Holmes. I want you to believe that, though I do not know that it matters now to anyone but myself. I planned only to ask him. It was watching him refuse, so gently, so certainly, as though 20 years of another woman's suffering were no more than an old paper to be tidied away, that I could not bear. When he had grown drowsy, and then insensible, she had opened the upper sash. A thing she knew from her long service in the wing could be done quietly if one knew the trick of the swollen frame, and had lowered him by a length of window cord taken from the linen store, easing him down into the yard below, with a care she said came from 30 years of moving patients who could not move themselves, and had closed the sash again after, and left the laudanum bottle by his hand, and gone back to her own bed in the nurses' hall to wait out the night, telling herself, as she told Holmes now, that the snow would finish what she had begun, and no one would ever ask the ground to account for itself. I did not sleep, Mr. Holmes. Whatever I told myself I meant to do, I lay in that narrow bed and listened to the wind work at the shutters, and I thought, over and over, that I might still go down and undo it, that there was still time to open that window again, and bring him in, and send for help, and let whatever came of it come. I did not go down. I want you to know that I understood, lying there, exactly what I was choosing, and exactly what I was choosing to leave undone, and that I chose it with a clear head, not in any fit of madness, whatever a jury may prefer to believe of an old woman when the time comes. She paused a long while before she spoke of the walk itself, and I saw Holmes wait for it without pressing her, in the manner I had watched him use with the most fragile of witnesses, offering silence as a kind of room for the truth to find its own way out, rather than crowding it with questions. And in the last hour, before the snow stopped, said Holmes quietly, you walked out to be certain the thing was done as you intended. I walked out to look at him one last time, she said, and I have wished every day since that I had not, for it is that walk across the yard, Mr. Holmes, and not the thing I did in the study, that I see now behind my own eyes whenever I close them, and I think you knew that, or you would not have troubled to stand at my window tonight in a dead man's hat. She sat back then, and something in her seemed at last to ease, as though the telling itself had lifted a physical weight from her shoulders, and she asked, in a voice gone almost light, whether there might be a little brandy in the cupboard by the door, for she found she was very tired, and thought she would like to sit by her own fire a while longer, before whatever must come next was asked of her. I fetched it for her myself, and Holmes did not press her further that night, and we sat with her a long while, in a silence that held, I think, more mercy in it than either of us could have put into words. She spoke once more before Tam Elliott's trap was heard on the lane, and it was of Honoria Sedgwick rather than of herself, a small memory offered almost as an afterthought, of an evening early in that last illness when the two of them had sat together by a fire much like this one, and Honoria, still lucid, still entirely herself, had asked only that someone, some day, believe her. I told her I believed her, Mr. Holmes, and I did. I have always believed her. It is a strange thing to spend 20 years believing a wronged woman entirely, and to spend those same 20 years helping to keep the world from ever knowing she was right. Holmes asked her, gently enough, whether she wished him to lay the full account before the coroner, or whether she would rather he waited until she herself had spoken to her solicitor, and she said she thought she would like a day or two to set her affairs in order first, if he could grant her that much, and Holmes, after a moment's consideration, said that he saw no harm in a day or two, provided she gave him her word to remain at the cottage and speak to no one else of what had passed between them that night. She gave it readily, and I believed her, and Holmes, I think, believed her too, for it was a promise he did not think to test again before Tam Elliott came at last with the trap to carry us back to the tower, and Mrs. Rennick to whatever remained of her own quiet reckoning. Chapter 11. Hollowfield after the thaw. The thaw came 3 days later, a sudden soft wind out of the west that took the snow off the moor in a single wet grey week, and by the time we left Ravenscar Tower, the yard beneath the study window showed nothing more remarkable than ordinary churned earth, as though the ground itself had been glad to let the whole business go with the frost. Mrs. Rennick did not live to see a courtroom. She died in her cottage a fortnight after that night by her own fire, quietly, in her sleep, the local doctor recording a failure of the heart, and I believe, though Holmes never said so outright, that he was not wholly sorry the law's slower machinery had been overtaken by nature's swifter one. Holmes had visited her twice more in that fortnight, alone, and told me little of either visit, beyond the fact that she had kept faithfully to her promise and spoken to no one else of the truth, occupying her remaining days instead with small, ordinary business, a letter to a nephew in Newcastle, the settling of a few debts in the village, the giving away of a clock, and a set of silver spoons to a young nurse newly come to Hollowfield, whom she had taken, in her last weeks, under a kind of quiet wing. It was Tam Elliot who brought us the news of her death, riding out to the inn before we had properly finished breakfast on our last full day in the county, and I remember Holmes setting down his cup very carefully and saying nothing at all for a full minute before he asked only whether she had been alone at the end. "Her nephew's wife found her, sir, come to sit with her of a morning as she'd taken to doing, said she looked peaceful enough, and the fire not yet out." Holmes nodded slowly at that, and it was some while before he spoke of the matter again. Squire Sedgwick, when he learned the whole truth, chose not to press the matter of his aunt's death into public record, for Honoria Sedgwick had been dead 20 years and had no kin left to be comforted by a scandal, and the family, he said plainly to Holmes, had already paid once in reputation for Tarrant's fraud, and did not care to pay again for the manner of its ending. Dr. Hollis was released without further trouble, and I heard, some months later, that the squire had settled the disputed bill in full, with a word of apology that Hollis, to his credit, accepted without triumph. The wing itself was not closed, though Sedgwick spoke for a time of doing so, and a new physician was found within the year, a quiet, competent man with no history in the county, and no ledgers of his own father's to disturb. The village talk of hauntings, Tam Elliot told us on the drive back to the station, had already begun to fade before we left, as such talk generally does once the living mystery behind it has been laid to rest, whatever shape that resting takes. The coroner's inquest, held some 10 days after Mrs. Rennick's death, returned a finding of misadventure in the matter of Dr. Alaric Venn, the medical evidence pointing, in the coroner's careful phrasing, to an excess of a sleeping draught taken without due care against the cold, a finding Holmes did not contest, though I knew, and he knew, that it was not the whole truth, nor even the greater part of it. He had laid before the coroner privately, in a sealed report I never saw the whole of, enough of the true circumstances to satisfy that officer's own conscience that no other soul stood in danger of wrongful blame, and no more than that, and the coroner, an old friend of Holmes's from an earlier case in the county, had asked no further questions than the report itself required. Squire Sedgwick came to see us off at the station himself, on the last morning of our stay, and thanked Holmes in terms rather warmer than his manner on the tower steps had promised, though I noted he did not once, in all his thanks, speak his aunt's name aloud, and Holmes did not offer it to him. "You have done the family a kindness, Mr. Holmes, whatever it has cost you to arrive at it." "I have done the truth a kindness, Squire Sedgwick, which is not always the same office, though I am glad, in this instance, that the two could be made to serve one another rather than stand opposed." Holmes said very little on the ride south, more from a settled quiet than from any restlessness now, and it was not until we were well past York, the fields beginning to green again at their edges in the way of a country waking slowly from a hard winter, that he spoke of the case at all. "I have solved a great many murders in my time, Watson, and I have never yet found one that gave me less satisfaction in the solving. She was not a wicked woman. She was a frightened girl who grew old inside a single unforgiven mistake, and who committed, at the very end of her life, the one act of violence she had spent 30 years of nursing trying to prevent in others. You might have kept the trap from her, Holmes, the hat at the window. I might have knocked at her door instead and asked her plainly," he agreed, "and perhaps I should have. I told myself the shock would bring the truth out cleaner and quicker than an ordinary interview, and I believe that was so, but I will own to you, Watson, since you are the only one who will ever read this account, that I have wondered once or twice since whether I did not enjoy the theatre of it a little more than the case required. It is a fault I try to watch in myself. I do not always succeed." I said nothing to that, for I did not think he wanted comfort, only the saying of it, and we rode the rest of the way to London in the particular companionable silence that had grown between us over so many cases, in so many corners of England, each one leaving its own small mark on the man beside me that the world, reading only of his triumphs, would never entirely know. Chapter 12. Baker Street, the sealed letter. It was some 3 weeks after our return that a letter came to Baker Street in a lawyer's careful hand, forwarded from Coldbeck, informing Holmes that Mrs. Elspeth Rennick had, in the last year of her life, left a sealed letter in the keeping of her solicitor to be sent to Mr. Sherlock Holmes of London in the event of her death, and not before. Holmes turned the letter over twice in his hands before he opened it, and I remember thinking as I watched him that I had rarely seen him approach any piece of evidence with quite that same reluctance. He read it through in silence, and then read it again, and then, instead of passing it to me as he generally did, folded it once more into its envelope and set it upon the mantel among the unanswered correspondence he was forever meaning to attend to, and never did. "What does she say?" I asked him, when it became clear he did not mean to volunteer it. "She says that she does not ask my forgiveness, for she does not believe it hers to ask, nor mine to give, and that the only mercy she craves is that Miss Honoria Sedgwick's name be spoken sometimes, by someone, so that a woman wronged twice over in her own lifetime should not go entirely unremembered in the world after it." Holmes stood a moment at the window, looking down into the grey London street, where the last of the season's snow was turning to slush beneath the cab wheels. "I attended her funeral, Watson, quietly, and told no one at Ravenscar Tower I had done so. I did not think it my place to attend her trial, since there was to be none, but I found I could not let her go into the ground with only her solicitor and the parson for company, whatever she had done, and whatever it cost the ledger of my own conscience to stand there. I asked him what else the letter had contained, beyond the request concerning Honoria's name, for I had seen it run to more than a single page, and Holmes had read it twice through before setting it aside. "A small account of her last weeks, Watson, nothing that touches the law. She wrote that she had slept better in that fortnight than she had slept in 20 years, which I confess I found the hardest sentence in the whole letter to read, harder even than her account of the window and the cord, for there is something in a confessed piece of that kind that asks more of a man's judgment than any confessed crime ever could. She wrote also that she hoped I would not think too harshly of Dr. Venn's memory, for he had done nothing in the whole affair but seek the truth, and it seemed to her a bitter thing that seeking it should have cost him his life, when the fault, as she saw it, lay 20 years further back than anything he had ever touched. I asked him whether he did think harshly of Venn, and he considered the question with more care than I had expected. I think Dr. Venn wanted to do a kind thing, Watson, and did not stop to weigh what the doing of it might cost another person who had spent 20 years arranging her whole life around never having to weigh it herself. It is not a fault confined to the country, or to the young, or to the well-meaning. I have known London men do the very same, and call it justice, and never once look behind them to see who was left standing in the wreckage of their good intention. I asked him whether he had ever answered the letter. "There is nothing in it that asks an answer," he said. "Only a name, and a small silence to be filled with it now and again, which I think, on the whole, is a debt more easily paid than most that come to this room, and I mean to pay it, in my own way, though I do not suppose the world will ever know the case was solved at all beyond a country doctor's accident, quietly closed." He said no more of it that evening, though I noticed, in the weeks that followed, that he kept the sealed letter itself, moved from the mantel to the small locked drawer of his own desk, where he was accustomed to keep the few papers of any case that had genuinely touched him, a drawer I had learned over the years to recognize as a kind of private register of the matters Holmes did not care to file away entirely, however completely they were closed in the world's eyes. I asked him once more, some months afterward, whether he had ever regretted the manner of the trap he had set at her window, and he considered the question longer than I had expected before answering it. "I regret that it was necessary, Watson, more than I regret having used it. A gentler approach might have taken a week to bring her to the same confession, or might never have brought her to it at all, and I do not know that a week's delay, or a lifetime's silence, would have served her better in the end than the single hard hour I gave her that night. I have turned it over a good deal, and I find I still cannot say with certainty which is the greater mercy, the swift shock or the slow patient waiting. Perhaps there is no single answer, and perhaps that uncertainty is itself the truest thing I have learned from the whole affair. He said no more of it that evening, and I have said no more of it myself in all the years since, save here, in this account, written long after both Holmes and I had grown old in our turn, when I judged that enough time had passed for a dead woman's small confession to be set down at last, without further harm to any living soul, and enough, I hope, to keep the promise Holmes made that grey afternoon, that somewhere, sometimes, the name of Honoria Sedgwick should still be spoken.